Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring you true, untold stories of courage, humanity, and war. Stories that remind us what it means to stay human, even in the darkest times. Now, let's go back to Germany, spring of 1945, where the war was ending, but hunger had just begun. The first thing they noticed wasn't silence, but emptiness. Villages without voices, streets without laughter. The war had ended, or so the papers said, but for those who lived among the ashes, peace brought only another kind of struggle. When the American 89th Infantry crossed the Rhine, the soldiers expected resistance. Instead, they found ruins. Houses collapsed like old lungs, farms stripped bare, faces watching from shattered windows, and among them, the children. They came quietly like shadows, thin legs, hollow eyes, small hands clutching tin cans or nothing at all. They didn't beg at first, they just stared. Private John Miller remembered it in his letter home. "We thought we'd seen everything in this war, but we hadn't seen hunger like that." The men still carried the smell of gunpowder on their uniforms. Their rations were counted carefully. One box for 5 men, barely enough to last a week, but when a boy no older than 10 appeared by the road, barefoot, holding a piece of cardboard shaped like a plate, no one hesitated. Miller broke his last can of beans in half. The boy didn't smile. He just whispered "Danke." That word stayed with them longer than the battles. They were stationed near a small village outside Weimar. The name wasn't on most maps anymore. The war had erased it. What was left were burned houses, broken glass, and people who moved like ghosts. Every day, trucks from the 89th Infantry rolled through the valley, carrying supplies east toward the Elbe, and every day, the same faces appeared along the road. Mothers, children, the old, waiting, watching, silent. No one had told the soldiers what to do with them. Their orders were simple: hold position, wait for contact from command. But as days passed, it became impossible to ignore what was in front of them. One morning, Sergeant Frank Donovan stepped out of his tent to find 2 children sitting by the jeep, a girl and a boy, maybe 8 and 12. They didn't speak, just looked at him with eyes too large for their faces. He motioned toward the mess tent. They didn't move. When he placed a piece of bread on the hood, they waited until he walked away before touching it. That night, the men talked about it over coffee that tasted like burnt mud. "They're everywhere," said Corporal Harris. "I saw one drinking from a puddle." "Command says not to interfere," someone muttered. "Civilians are not our mission." Donovan stared into the fire. "Yeah, but I didn't sign up to watch kids starve." He didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, he gathered what was left from breakfast: a handful of biscuits, a tin of peaches, some powdered milk. When no one was looking, he slipped out behind the supply tent and left it near the road. By afternoon, it was gone. Word spread fast. The soldiers began leaving scraps: bits of bread, a spoon of jam, even a chocolate bar one man had been saving since Christmas. No one talked about it officially, but every man knew, in war, kindness was its own form of rebellion. By the end of the week, the children no longer hid. They came closer, timid but trusting. A few even smiled. The girl from the jeep, they learned her name was Anneliese. She spoke softly, her German hesitant when she tried English. "My mama gone, papa gone, only my brother." Miller gave her his dog tag, string to wear as a necklace. "You keep that," he said. "It means you're one of us now." She didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. Then came the order that changed everything. A new officer arrived from division headquarters, Lieutenant Caldwell, young, polished, his uniform still clean from headquarters duty. He saw the line of children near the camp, and his face hardened. "Who authorized this?" he demanded. No one answered. "This is not a relief operation. We are soldiers, not aid workers. Rations are to be accounted for. Every can, every biscuit." That night, no one ate in the mess tent. The food was there, but the silence was heavier than hunger. Donovan looked at Miller across the table. "We can't stop now," he said quietly. "You've seen their faces." Miller nodded. "Then we don't stop. We just get smarter." And so they did. They began hiding food in empty ammunition boxes, marking them as spent shells. They stored powdered milk inside fuel drums cleaned of residue. Harris drew fake ration numbers on the manifests. It became a secret operation, not of war, but of mercy. The next morning, they distributed the food deeper into the village, away from the main road. The children met them behind a collapsed church wall. "Don't tell anyone," Donovan said in broken German. "This stays between us." The kids nodded solemnly, clutching cans and biscuits as if they were gold. Each day the soldiers risked punishment, but none of them cared. They'd fought through the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine under fire, watched friends die in mud and smoke. This, they said, was something worth doing. Weeks passed. The trees turned green again. The sound of artillery was replaced by birdsong, but the scars of war remained. The children grew stronger. One of them, a boy named Lucas, began helping the soldiers carry water from the stream. He was small but quick, always smiling despite the hunger that had shaped him. When asked his age, he shrugged. No one had told him his birthday since 1942. One afternoon, as Donovan watched Lucas chase a stray ball near the camp, he realized it was the first time he'd seen a child laugh in Germany. It sounded strange, almost out of place, like music in a graveyard. For a moment, even the men unloading trucks stopped to listen. But mercy never goes unnoticed for long. Caldwell returned during inspection. He found the false manifests, the missing rations, the hidden crates under the tarps. His face went red. "You disobeyed direct orders," he shouted. "You compromised logistics. You think you're heroes? You're thieves." Donovan stood at attention. "If saving kids is theft, sir, then I'll take the charge." Caldwell glared at him, then at the children peeking from behind the ruins. He opened his mouth and closed it again. After a long silence, he turned away. He walked off. The men stood frozen for a moment before realizing what had happened. Miller broke the silence. "Guess we just got A?" That night, rain fell over the camp. The soldiers sat in their tents, listening to it patter against canvas. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter echoed faintly through the dark. Donovan smiled to himself and whispered, "That's worth more than medals." By dawn, they were already packing to move east. Orders came through. New positions near Erfurt. The children gathered by the road as the trucks lined up. Lucas and Annalise stood in front, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Miller leaned from the jeep and waved. "Keep growing, kid," he said. Donovan knelt down to Annalise's level. "You'll be all right," he said softly. She looked up, eyes wet. "Thank you, mister." He pressed something in her hand, a small tin spoon, engraved with a single word, "Home." As the convoy rolled out, the children ran beside the road until the dust swallowed them. Donovan turned once more, watching their small figures disappear into the mist. War takes everything, he thought, but sometimes it gives back one small piece of our soul. The letters came later, from soldiers writing home, trying to explain what they'd seen. None of them mentioned the battles or medals. They wrote about the children, about how, in a land that had once been the enemy's, they'd rediscovered what it meant to be human. The train rattled softly as it crossed the green hills of Thuringia. The war was long over, but John Miller still felt its echo in his bones. It had been 20 years since he'd last seen this land, and yet every curve of the track, every line of pine trees, stirred something buried deep inside him. Outside, the countryside was alive again. Children on bicycles, farmers in fields, birds rising from golden wheat. It was hard to believe that once this same soil had been soaked in ash and blood. Miller held a small envelope in his hand. Yellowed, creased, its edges worn smooth from years of being opened and closed. Inside it was a photograph. For soldiers in dusty uniforms, smiling faintly beside a group of thin German children. At the center of the photo stood a little girl holding a tin spoon, the one with the word home scratched into the handle. He had kept that picture in his wallet through everything. Through marriage, work, sleepless nights. Sometimes, when the noise of the city felt too loud, he'd take it out and stare at those faces. The war was supposed to have ended, but something in him had never left that field. Now, standing at the small train station of Weimar, he stepped onto the platform with the awkwardness of a man walking into his own memory. The air smelled of rain and old stone. The language around him was the same, but softer now, less sharp, less fearful. The world had changed. Germany had changed. He rented a small car and drove east along narrow country roads, past fields and rebuilt villages. The sign at the edge of the valley was new, white letters on green metal, but the place was the same. The village had a name again, Children played by a fountain that hadn't existed back then. The church that had been a pile of rubble now stood tall, its bells ringing faintly through the hills. Miller parked near the square and got out slowly. His knees stiff, he looked around, searching for anything familiar. Then he saw it, a crooked oak tree near the edge of town, bent just the way it had been in 1945. He walked toward it. Every step brought back echoes. The hum of engines, the laughter of soldiers, the whisper of Danky from a child's lips. He knelt by the tree and placed his hand on the bark, rough beneath his palm. That's when he heard a voice behind him. "Can I help you, sir?" He turned. A woman stood there, mid-30s, maybe a little older. Her hair was tied back, her eyes kind but cautious. She wore a simple blue dress, her hands dusty from gardening. I don't mean to intrude," Miller said softly. "I used to be here a long time ago, after the war." Her expression changed, curiosity mixed with something deeper. "American?" He nodded. 89th Infantry. We were stationed just outside town. I knew some of the people here." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled faintly. "You fed us." Miller froze. His heart stumbled in his chest. "You remember?" She nodded. "I was 8. My brother Lucas and I. We came to your camp. You gave me bread and milk and a spoon." She reached into her pocket and pulled it out. The same small tin spoon, worn but whole, the word home still etched across it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the smell of grass and earth. Miller blinked, his vision blurring. "I thought," he began, then stopped. "I didn't know if any of you survived." Her smile trembled. "We did, because of you." She led him to her house, a small cottage rebuilt from the stones of the old one. Inside, photos lined the walls. Her children, her husband, her parents long gone. On a shelf sat a faded American dog tag. "I kept everything," she said quietly. "It reminded me that kindness can come from anywhere, even from those we were told to fear." Miller sat at her kitchen table, the same sunlight falling across it that had once lit the ruins. "We didn't do much," he said. "Just food, just a few cans." She shook her head. "No, you gave us life. You gave us hope when there was nothing left." They talked for hours about the village, the years after the war, the families that had rebuilt from nothing. She told him Lucas had become a teacher. She worked at a small bakery. Every Sunday, she said, they gave free bread to children in memory of those who once fed us. When evening came, they walked together to the churchyard. A plaque near the wall caught his eye. It read, "To the soldiers who came not to conquer, but to heal." Miller stood there for a long time. The years between then and now felt like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to forget. As he turned to leave, Annalise handed him the spoon. "You should keep it," she said. He closed her hand around it instead. "No," he said softly. "It belongs here." The bells rang overhead, clear, steady, alive. That night, in his hotel room, Miller wrote in his journal for the first time in years. His handwriting was shaky, but the words came easily. "War shows us what men can destroy, but mercy shows us what they can rebuild." He placed the photo beside his bed. The soldiers, the children, the spoon shining faintly in the middle. Then he closed his eyes, hearing once again the laughter of a girl in a ruined world. The museum was quiet that morning, just the soft sound of shoes on tile, the murmur of voices in the distance, the hum of air conditioning that kept the rooms cool even in summer. In the corner of the Liberation of Europe exhibit behind glass stood a small display. A faded photograph, a tin spoon with a single word engraved on it, "Home," and a handwritten note. Visitors passed by without realizing that behind those objects was an entire world. The note was yellowed, written in uneven English script. "To the children who taught us what peace means, J.M., 1945. A young man stood in front of the glass, staring at it longer than most. His name was David Miller, grandson of the man who had written that note. He had grown up hearing fragments of the story. Your grandfather fed children in Germany, his father once said. He never talked much about it, but he kept that picture until the day he died. Now, seeing it here real and solid, something in him shifted. He'd come all the way from Ohio to this museum in Berlin. Part of a trip he hadn't even planned, but standing there, he felt as if someone had been waiting for him. Next to him, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes was also looking at the exhibit. She turned and smiled faintly. "You're looking at the spoon," she said in German-accented English. David nodded. "My grandfather gave it to a girl during the war. Her name was Annalise." The woman's smile deepened. "Yes, she was my mother." David blinked, unsure he'd heard right. "She told me the story all my life," the woman continued, "how American soldiers shared their food, how it saved her and her brother. She said one of them wrote the word home on a spoon, so she'd never forget what kindness feels like." David's throat tightened. "She kept it all these years?" "She did," the woman said softly. "When she died, we brought it here, so people could see that mercy can live even through war." They stood there together in silence. Two strangers bound by the memory of people who had once met in the ruins of a broken world. On the wall beside the display, a small plaque read, "Spring, 1945. American soldiers of the 89th Infantry provided food to starving children in a German village near Weimar. One act of compassion became a lasting symbol of reconciliation." David looked at the photograph again, his grandfather, younger than he'd ever imagined, smiling faintly beside that little girl, the same girl whose daughter now stood beside him. He smiled. "I think he'd be glad to know she made it." The woman's eyes glistened. "And I think she'd be glad to know he remembered." Outside, Berlin was alive. Tourists, students, children laughing in the streets. The city had changed, rebuilt from ashes, full of noise and color, but inside the museum, time still held its breath. David sat on a bench across from the exhibit, watching as others passed by. Some stopped, some didn't, most didn't know the story, and yet the air around the display carried something unmistakable: warmth, gratitude, peace. He pulled a small notebook from his bag and wrote, "The war ended long ago, but sometimes the smallest kindness outlives everything else." He closed the notebook, took one last look at the spoon, and walked out into the sunlight. The bells of a nearby church began to ring, the same melody that once echoed through the valley near Weimar. Far away, in that same valley, a small bakery still stood. Every Sunday morning, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the streets, and a sign by the door read in both English and German, "For the hungry, the lost, and the weary, there is always a place called home." The road to Weimar wound through quiet hills and forests. The fields were gold with summer wheat, and every few miles the ruins of old stone walls marked where the front once passed. David sat in the passenger seat of a small rental car. The window open, the smell of warm earth filling the air. The woman driving, Clara, daughter of Annalise, hummed softly to the radio. Neither of them spoke for a while. For David, it felt unreal. He'd grown up hearing the war described in black and white. Good versus evil, victory and defeat, but sitting here beside the daughter of someone his grandfather once fed, the war suddenly felt human again, fragile, messy, full of faces instead of numbers. Clara turned down the radio. "My mother used to say," she began, "that the world isn't divided into enemies and friends. It's divided into those who remember and those who forget." David smiled faintly. "She sounds like someone my grandfather would have liked." They passed a sign that read, "Eichenfeld, 2 kilometers. "That's the name of the village," Clara said. "It used to be nothing more than ruins. The church was rebuilt in the 50s. The bakery came later. My mother worked there until she died." The car slowed as they entered the village. Cobblestone streets, flower boxes on windowsills, children riding bikes down the lane. And there, the same crooked oak tree that had stood since 1945, its branches now massive and green. Clara parked by the square. "That's where your grandfather's camp was," she said, pointing toward a small meadow near the river. "The tents, the trucks, my mother described it exactly." They walked in silence. The meadow was bright with sunlight, buzzing with insects. The river still flowed the same way, steady and quiet. David knelt by the bank, his hand touching the grass. He imagined the trucks lined up, the soldiers laughing, the sound of cans being opened, children whispering Danke. Clara stood behind him, holding a small paper bag. "I brought something," she said. Inside was a loaf of fresh bread, still warm. "It's what my mother used to give to the children here every Sunday." David smiled, swallowing the lump in his throat. Then let's do the same. They broke the bread and placed it on the river stone, letting pieces float away downstream. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of wheat and water, and somewhere a bell tolled in the distance. Later, they visited the old cemetery behind the church. Most of the graves were new, but a few stones were worn smooth with time. Clara stopped by one marked simply, Frank Donovan, U.S. Army, 1920 to 1945. David froze. That was my grandfather's commanding officer, he whispered. He died before they left Germany. Clara knelt, brushing leaves from the stone. My mother planted flowers here every spring, she said. She said he was family. David stood quietly. He was, to her, to my grandfather, to all of them. The sky darkened slowly into evening. As the first stars appeared, they lit candles by the grave and watched the flame flicker against the wind. They returned to the car, but didn't leave right away. The village square glowed under soft lamps. A few people walked by, nodding politely. The sound of laughter drifted from an open cafe window. It's strange, David said finally. All my life I thought the past was just history, things written in books, told by teachers, but it's right here, still breathing. Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the light. It's not history when someone remembers your name. He smiled. Then maybe that's why I came. She nodded. And maybe that's why you'll stay. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. The present and past folded together like the pages of an old letter. Then the church bells rang again, deep, resonant, echoing through the hills. The next morning, they met the local mayor, an elderly man who'd grown up hearing the same story. We call it Der Tagdergut, he told them, the Day of Kindness. Every year, the village held a small gathering by the river. Children from the local school brought flowers and bread. They didn't call a holiday, but everyone knew why they came. It reminds us, the mayor said, that even when nations fight, people can still be good. David and Clara stood among the crowd as the ceremony began. The priest spoke a few words, and then the children sang an old hymn, the same one Annalise's mother used to hum. The air shimmered with sunlight, the river whispering below. When the song ended, the oldest child stepped forward and placed a small bouquet beside Donovan's grave. Then, in halting English, she said, "Thank you." David closed his eyes. For the first time, he felt peace. Not the kind written in treaties or marked by parades, but the quiet peace that comes when the past is no longer a wound, but a memory that breathes softly through generations. He turned to Clara. Maybe this is what forgiveness looks like. She smiled. No, this is what home looks like. They stood together under the oak tree, the same one that had watched it all, as sunlight poured through its leaves like a blessing. The orders came at dawn. By noon, the 89th Infantry would be gone, headed west toward the ships that would take them home. The camp was a blur of movement. Engines starting, tents coming down, crates being loaded. The war was over, and now the men were finally going home. But no one felt like celebrating. There was too much silence between the sounds of the trucks. Sergeant Miller stood beside his jeep, watching the village across the river. Smoke rose gently from chimneys. The air smelled of rain and spring. Somewhere, a church bell rang. He looked down at his hands. Rough, scarred, stained with oil and memory. He'd survived battles, frostbite, hunger, but what stayed with him were the faces, the children, the tiny hands that had reached for food through fear and ruin. Behind him, Private Harris walked up carrying a small wooden crate. "Sir," he said, "the last of the supplies. What do we do with it?" Miller looked at the crate, then at the riverbank. "Leave it," he said quietly. "They'll find it." Harris hesitated. "Sir, that's against." "I said leave it." He nodded and set it down gently on the grass. Inside were tins of milk, biscuits, chocolate, everything they had left. The sound of laughter drifted from across the water. Miller looked up. Children were running down the hill. Lucas among them, his shoes too big, his face brighter than he remembered. Behind him came Annalise, clutching a small bunch of wildflowers. They crossed the shallow river barefoot, giggling as they splashed through the cold water. "Mr. John," she shouted, "you go home?" Miller smiled. "Yeah, sweetheart, we're going home." She looked at the trucks, then back at him. "You come back." He knelt down, his heart tightening. Maybe not me, but maybe someday. She pressed the flowers into his hand. For remember. He nodded, swallowing hard. I'll remember. When the convoy started to move, the villagers gathered by the road, old men in worn coats, women holding babies, children waving with both hands. Some cried openly, others just stood still, too full of emotion to speak. Miller sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching as they rolled past the crowd. Lucas ran alongside, breathless, trying to keep up. Miller tossed him something, his dog tag, hanging from string. The boy caught it, clutching it to his chest like a medal. "Don't lose that," Miller called out. "That's your proof you're tougher than me." Lucas grinned, eyes bright through the dust. "Danky, Mr. John." As the truck climbed the hill, the village fell away behind them. Roofs shrinking, figures fading, the river glinting like silver under the morning sun. Harris leaned against the rail beside him. "Think they'll be all right?" Miller looked back one last time. "They already are." Hours later, as the convoy crossed the open fields toward the west, dark clouds gathered overhead. Rain began to fall, slow, steady, like a benediction. The men didn't rush to cover it. They let it wash over them, cleansing the dirt and smoke of years. From somewhere behind, the sound of church bells drifted faintly through the rain. Harris tilted his head. "You hear that?" Miller nodded. "Yeah. Sounds like they're saying goodbye." Miller smiled through the mist. "No," he said softly. "Sounds like they're saying thank you." The road stretched ahead, vanishing into fog. Trucks rumbled on, their engines deep and steady. The war was gone, but the echo of kindness would stay, carried in the laughter of children, in the smell of bread, in the sound of bells that once rang over ruins. And somewhere, under the oak tree by the river, the wooden crate sat half buried in grass, rain dripping from its lid. Beside it lay a small tin spoon, shining faintly in the gray light, the word home still clear after all the years of fire and dust. Sometimes wars end not with victory parades, but with the quiet act of a man giving a child his last piece of bread. And that is how peace begins.